Kinsley was 74, a retired librarian from a small coastal town. She'd spent most of her life surrounded by the quiet comfort of books, the soft rustle of pages, and the gentle hum of the library's old ceiling fan. Her mornings had always been simple. Wake with the sunrise, open the curtains to let the light in, and pour herself a tall glass of cool water before anything else. It was a ritual she'd followed for decades, one she believed was the purest way to start her day. But one morning, something felt different. It happened in early spring, just as the sky was turning a soft gold outside her window. Kinsley woke, stretched her arms, and reached for the glass of water she'd left on the nightstand the night before. She took several big gulps, almost without thinking, eager to quench the dryness in her throat. Within minutes, she felt it, a sudden rush of lightheadedness, her vision dimming at the edges, her heart giving a strange, uneven flutter. She sat there, glass in hand, feeling as though her body had just reminded her of a truth she didn't want to face. At first, she brushed it off. Maybe she'd stood up too quickly, maybe she hadn't slept well. But as the days went by, small things began to change. Her energy in the mornings wasn't the same. She noticed her legs felt heavier, her chest tighter, and there were moments when her thoughts seemed to slow. Friends told her it was just age catching up, but deep down, she felt something was being overlooked. And it wasn't until her doctor's gentle words, "Kinsley, it might be the way you're starting your day," that she began to look at her mornings differently. I still remember the way she told me this story, sitting across from me with her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. Her voice carried a mix of confusion and quiet relief, as if she'd finally found the missing piece of a puzzle she'd been working on for years. She spoke of how something as simple as drinking water, something she thought could only help, had been quietly working against her, not because water itself was harmful, but because her body, in its 70s, needed a different kind of care than it had at 40 or 50. That conversation stayed with me, not because it was dramatic or rare, but because it was so common. I've met countless older adults who do everything right and yet still feel off, tired, or unsettled. Often, it's not about big mistakes or serious illnesses, but about small daily choices, like how and when we drink our first glass of water, that can tip the balance toward vitality or discomfort. Kinsley's story became a reminder to me, and now to you, that our habits deserve to evolve as we do. So, as you listen today, I want you to picture Kinsley, a woman who thought she knew her body better than anyone, only to discover that it had been quietly asking for a gentler start to the day. This is not about fear, it's about awareness, about listening to those subtle whispers before they become alarms. And maybe, just maybe, it's about giving yourself the grace to change something you thought you'd never need to. Because sometimes the smallest changes, the ones you make before the sun is fully up, are the ones that shape how the rest of your day and your life will feel. The morning after her doctor's gentle warning, Kinsley woke before the alarm, the room still tinted in soft gray light. Outside, the gulls were already circling the shore, their cries echoing faintly through the open window. She sat up slowly, feeling the familiar stiffness in her knees, and reached instinctively for the glass of water on her nightstand. It was still half full from the night before, the surface glinting faintly in the early light. Her hand paused in midair. For the first time in years, she didn't gulp it down. She just looked at it, remembering the doctor's words. "Your body has been resting all night, Kinsley. It needs a gentle wake-up, not a flood." She took a small sip, letting it linger in her mouth before swallowing. The coolness was pleasant, but not shocking, the way it usually was when she drank half a glass in one breath. She noticed how her breathing stayed steady, her chest free from that strange tightness she'd felt before. It was almost strange how something so small could feel so different. She sat there a moment longer, glass still in hand, as the light shifted from gray to gold across the quilt at the foot of her bed. Kinsley had always believed that more water meant more health, especially in the morning. She'd read it in magazines, heard it from friends, even seen it on TV. Start your day with a full glass to kickstart your system. But no one had explained how the body, especially an older body, doesn't always appreciate sudden changes. Overnight, the heart slows, the blood pressure lowers, and the digestive system rests. Throwing a large volume of water into that quiet state all at once can send the body scrambling to adjust. She hadn't known this, and the knowledge unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite explain. As she sat by the window, sipping slowly, she thought about the mornings that had left her lightheaded. How many times had she brushed off that dizzy wave as just getting older? She remembered the one morning she nearly dropped the coffee pot because her hands had trembled right after she finished a tall glass of water. That day, she'd blamed the weather, telling herself the sudden warmth was making her sluggish. Now, she wondered if it had been her own habit all along, pushing her body harder than it was ready for. Later that week, Kinsley's daughter Lila came by for breakfast. They sat at the small kitchen table, the smell of toasted sourdough filling the air, and Kinsley told her about the doctor's advice. Lila's brow furrowed as she poured herself some tea. "I never thought about that," she admitted. "I drink mine fast too, but I guess I'm still in my 40s. Kinsley smiled faintly. "That's just it, Lila. I used to do the same at your age without a second thought, but our bodies, they change the rules on us without telling us." That morning, instead of coffee first or a full gulp of cold water, Kinsley tried something new. She poured half a glass of room temperature water, sat in her favorite chair by the kitchen window, and sipped it while listening to the ocean's steady rhythm. She didn't rush. She didn't check the clock. And when she stood to make breakfast, there was no dizzy sway, no odd flutter in her chest. Just a quiet steadiness she hadn't felt in months. She realized then that this wasn't about the water itself. It was about pacing. It was about meeting her body where it was, not where it used to be. There was no shame in that, no loss. In fact, there was a kind of dignity in learning to listen more closely, to offer herself gentleness in the simplest of ways. And in that moment, she understood what her doctor had meant about the gentle wake-up. It wasn't just for her organs or her circulation. It was for her whole being, a reminder that her mornings didn't have to begin with urgency to have meaning. A few mornings after she began slowing down her first sip, Kinsley found herself standing in the kitchen, pill organizer open on the counter. The little compartments clicked softly as she flipped them open, the colored capsules and tablets a familiar part of her routine. She had taken the same blood pressure medication for years, along with something for her heart rhythm, tiny, unassuming pills that she never gave much thought to, other than making sure she didn't forget them. Her habit was always the same: wake up, drink a big glass of water, then take her pills. But lately, she'd been wondering if that order really mattered. The thought came back to her when she remembered a story her doctor had shared during her last appointment. He'd told her about another patient, a retired teacher, who had been struggling to keep her blood pressure steady despite taking her medicine religiously. It turned out she was washing her pills down with an entire glass of water before breakfast, unknowingly flushing them through her system too quickly for full absorption. It had taken just one small change, taking them with a small sip instead, then waiting a little while before her usual hydration, and to make the reading stable again. That morning, Kinsley decided to test it for herself. She poured only a quarter glass of water, took her medication slowly, and then set the glass down. It felt strange, almost incomplete, to not follow the pills with a full drink. Her throat still wanted more water, but she resisted, telling herself she'd wait 20 minutes. She busied herself by tidying the counter, slicing a pear for breakfast, and watching the light creep across the kitchen tiles. By the time she picked up the glass again, she realized she felt normal. No sudden drop in energy, no hint of shakiness. Later that week, she mentioned it to her pharmacist while picking up a refill. The woman behind the counter smiled knowingly. "You'd be surprised how many people don't think about timing," she said. "Especially with heart or blood pressure meds, the amount of liquid and when you drink it can make a big difference." She explained that some medications are meant to work best on an empty stomach, others after food, but almost all of them need the right conditions to be absorbed properly. Too much water too quickly could dilute them or push them into the digestive tract before the body was ready to use them. That conversation lingered with Kinsley. She thought about how she'd always prided herself on being careful with her health, reading labels, eating balanced meals, walking every day. But in all her years, no one had told her that the very water she trusted could quietly work against her medicine. It wasn't dangerous in a dramatic way, but it was enough to chip away at the benefits she depended on. One afternoon, her daughter Lila stopped by again, dropping in with a basket of groceries and a new novel she thought her mother would like. As they sat together peeling oranges, Kinsley shared what the pharmacist had said. Lila frowned thoughtfully. "You know, Dad used to do that too. Take his pills with a huge glass. I wonder if it ever made a difference." They both fell quiet for a moment, the air between them filled with the faint citrus scent. Then Lila reached for her mother's hand. "I'm glad you're paying attention to these little things now, Mom. Sometimes they're what keep us out of the hospital." Kinsley smiled at that. She hadn't thought of it as anything heroic, just a small adjustment in a long chain of habits. But the truth was, she felt a subtle difference already. Her mornings were steadier, less rushed. She didn't get that odd wave of tiredness before breakfast. She began to realize that caring for herself wasn't just about the big things like exercise or diet, but also about protecting the quiet moments when her body was most vulnerable. The next time she lined up her pills on the counter, she poured the same small glass of water and took her time, letting the act feel deliberate rather than automatic. It was a tiny pause in her day, a moment of awareness that reminded her she was still learning, still capable of adjusting, even after 74 years. And in that pause, she felt a kind of peace, knowing she was giving her medicine and herself the best chance to do their work. It happened on a quiet Sunday morning, the kind Kinsley used to cherish most. Rain tapped gently against the kitchen window, and the air smelled faintly of the sea. She had woken early, taken her pills with the usual small sip of water, and then poured herself another half glass to enjoy slowly. The warmth of the quilt still clung to her shoulders, and without thinking, she wandered back to her bedroom and sank onto the bed, leaning against the pillows. The glass was still in her hand, and she took the last swallow before setting it on the nightstand. It felt natural, comforting even, to rest there for just a few more minutes before starting her day. But not long after she settled in, the familiar heaviness in her chest returned. It wasn't sharp, but it was insistent, a slow, creeping pressure that made her shift uncomfortably. A faint burn began to rise in her throat, and she swallowed against it. Her mind tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just the rainy weather, maybe the bread she'd eaten late last night. Still, the sensation lingered longer than she liked. By the time she swung her legs over the side of the bed, her stomach felt unsettled, and she had no desire for breakfast at all. Later that day, while having tea with her neighbor Carol, the subject came up. Carol, a retired nurse, listened quietly before nodding. "It's more common than you think," she said. "When you drink water and then lie down, especially on an empty stomach, gravity isn't helping you anymore. Even plain water can push back into your esophagus if the valve between your stomach and throat isn't closing tightly. And that valve gets weaker with age." She went on to explain how lying flat so soon after drinking can stir up reflux without the classic burning pain. Sometimes it's just pressure, bloating, or that lingering fullness Kinsley had felt. Kinsley thought back to the time she'd done this without realizing it. How many mornings had she sipped water in bed, then pulled the blanket closer and drifted back into half sleep? She'd always assumed water was harmless no matter when or how she drank it. But now, the idea that even water could cause this quiet discomfort made her pause. The body, she realized, didn't simply react to what you gave it, but also to when and how. The next morning, she tried something different. After her slow, careful sips, she stayed upright, sitting at the small table by the window. The rain had stopped, and pale sunlight pooled across the floor. She let her hands rest around her mug of warm tea, feeling its gentle heat soak into her fingers. She stayed like that for half an hour, reading a chapter of the novel Lila had brought over, before she moved on with her day. The difference was immediate. There was no heaviness, no creeping discomfort, just a lightness she hadn't noticed she'd been missing. That simple choice became part of her rhythm. Even on cold mornings when the bed tempted her back, she'd tell herself, 15 minutes, let gravity do its work. She didn't think of it as a chore, but as a kindness to her body, a quiet respect for the way it now preferred to be treated. It was a small shift, yet it rippled outward, giving her more comfortable mornings and a steadier appetite. One afternoon, while Kinsley and Lila were arranging flowers in the kitchen, Lila asked if the reflux had returned. Kinsley shook her head, smiling. "Not once since I started sitting up. It's such a little thing, but it's made a world of difference." She could see the curiosity in her daughter's eyes, as if Lila was beginning to imagine how these gentle adjustments might matter for her own health someday. It struck Kinsley then that aging wasn't about losing strength all at once. It was about learning the small ways to keep that strength intact, giving the body every chance to work with you instead of against you. Staying upright after drinking might have seemed trivial to someone else, but to her it was a reminder that awareness is a form of care. And care, no matter how small, always leaves its mark. For most of her adult life, Kinsley had loved the bracing shock of cold water in the morning. It was a habit she picked up in her 40s after reading some magazine article that promised ice water jumpstarts your metabolism. She would pad into the kitchen, open the fridge, and pour herself a tall glass straight from the pitcher she always kept chilled. That first gulp used to make her feel wide awake, as if she'd thrown open a window inside her own body. But one particularly bright morning, as the light spilled over the countertop, she felt something different. The cold water hit her stomach and sent a quick, almost painful tightening through her middle. A dull ache settled in her lower back, not sharp, but deep, like a knot that wouldn't loosen. She shrugged it off, thinking maybe she'd slept in an odd position. Yet over the next week, the same thing happened again. The icy rush no longer felt invigorating. Instead, it left her feeling tense, even chilled, long after she'd finished drinking. The turning point came during her monthly checkup when she casually mentioned it to her doctor. He listened with that steady, patient attention she'd come to appreciate, then explained how, with age, the digestive tract and kidneys become more sensitive to sudden temperature shocks. Your organs like warmth, he told her gently. When you pour ice-cold water into a system that's been resting all night, it's like waking it up with a bucket of ice. The blood vessels in your stomach constrict, digestion slows, and your kidneys, already doing their quiet work, feel the strain. Kinsley sat back in her chair, surprised. All those years, she'd thought she was doing something healthy. She might have been making her mornings harder without realizing it. The idea that her body no longer wanted the same wake-up call was both humbling and oddly comforting. It meant she could give herself permission to be gentler, to move away from the jolts and toward something steadier. The very next day, she swapped her cold pitcher for a ceramic jug she left out overnight. The water was room temperature, soft on the tongue and easy on her stomach. On a whim, she dropped in a thin slice of lemon. The scent alone lifted her mood, and the first sip felt different. Not a shock, but a warm handshake to the day. She sat in her chair by the window, feeling her body respond in quiet agreement. No cramping, no tightness, just a smooth settling into the morning. When Lila stopped by that weekend, Kinsley offered her a glass. "No ice?" Lila teased, glancing into the cup. "Not anymore," Kinsley said, explaining what the doctor had told her. Her daughter took a sip and smiled. "It's actually nice, softer. I can see why you switched." They ended up talking about how many little habits we carry forward without questioning them, even after our bodies start hinting they're ready for change. The following week, Kinsley noticed something she hadn't expected. Her appetite in the mornings returned. She no longer felt that sluggish knot in her stomach that sometimes kept her from enjoying breakfast. Even her walks to the mailbox felt easier. She didn't have that faint, lingering chill in her limbs that cold water used to bring. It was such a small swap, yet it gave her back a kind of ease she didn't know she'd lost. She began to think of it as more than just changing her water's temperature. It was a quiet act of kindness toward herself, an acknowledgement that her body deserved comfort over shock. She still remembered the sharp, bracing feeling of those icy gulps, but now she understood they'd been waking her up in the wrong way, jolting her system instead of supporting it. The warmth, on the other hand, made her mornings unfold more naturally, like the slow, steady bloom of sunlight across her kitchen table. And each time she filled her cup now, she felt a quiet gratitude for the advice, for the shift, and for the reminder that change doesn't have to mean loss. Sometimes it's just finding a gentler way forward. It was one of those mornings when the wind howled in from the coast, rattling the windows and making the world outside seem colder than it really was. Kinsley lingered in bed longer than usual, wrapped in the warmth of her quilt, reluctant to face the chill. By the time she got up, she was already thinking about the errands she needed to run, picking up a prescription, mailing a letter, stopping by the market. The glass of water she usually kept on her nightstand sat untouched. She told herself she'd have some later, maybe after she got dressed. She moved through her morning without thinking much about it. No water, no tea, just her pills with the smallest sip. Enough to swallow them, then straight into her coat and out the door. It wasn't until she reached the post office that she noticed something was off. As she stood in line, the room seemed to tilt slightly. Her legs felt unsteady, and a faint cramp began to tighten in her right calf. She shifted her weight, trying to shake it off, but the feeling lingered. By the time she got home, there was a dull ache pulsing in her temples, the kind that made her want to sit down and close her eyes. She poured herself a glass of water and drank it slowly, but it didn't undo the way her body felt. Heavy, sluggish, and oddly disconnected, as if she was moving through a fog. That afternoon, she called her doctor's office to ask about it, half expecting them to dismiss it as nothing. Instead, the nurse listened carefully and then said, "Kinsley, even mild dehydration can set you back more than you realize, especially first thing in the morning. Your body's been without water for hours while you sleep. By the time you wake, you're already a little behind." She went on to explain that for older adults, even a small drop in hydration can thicken the blood slightly, affect circulation, and trigger dizziness or muscle cramps. The words made Kinsley think back to all the mornings she'd gone without water in the past, believing coffee later would make up for it. She remembered days when she'd felt strangely irritable or unusually tired, and never once considered that the absence of a simple glass of water might be the reason. It was unsettling to think she'd ignored something so basic for so long. The next morning, she decided to test the nurse's advice. Before anything else, before checking the clock, before reaching for her robe, she sat up, swung her legs over the side of the bed, and took a slow drink from the half glass of room temperature water she'd set there the night before. It wasn't dramatic, but she noticed the difference within minutes. Her head felt clearer, her movements more steady, and that stiffness in her knees eased just enough to make getting dressed easier. Over the next few days, she kept the habit, even on mornings when she wasn't thirsty. She learned that waiting until her body asked for water was too late. The thirst signal, her doctor had said, wasn't as sharp as it used to be. Drinking right away wasn't about quenching thirst. It was about giving her body a head start, like opening the blinds to let the morning light in. One Saturday, Lila stopped by with fresh bread from the bakery. As they sliced into it, Kinsley told her about the morning she'd skipped water and how it had made her feel. Lila listened with a seriousness that made her mother pause. "I've had mornings like that too," she admitted. "I just never thought water, or the lack of it, could make such a difference." They shared a smile over the simplicity of it all, realizing that sometimes the smallest acts could change the entire tone of a day. From then on, Kinsley treated her morning water like a quiet promise to herself. It didn't matter if it was only half a glass, it mattered that she showed up for her body before asking it to show up for her. And each time she lifted that glass to her lips, she remembered that the difference between a shaky start and a steady one could be as small as a few mindful sips. By the end of the month, Kinsley's mornings looked nothing like they had before. They weren't rushed anymore, nor were they clouded by that uneasy haze she'd come to accept as just getting older. Instead, there was a gentle order to things, a rhythm that made each step feel intentional rather than automatic. She would wake to the soft light pressing through the curtains, sit up slowly, and take a slow sip from the half glass of room temperature water waiting on her nightstand. No gulping, no icy shock, no skipping, just a steady, quiet beginning. It surprised her how quickly these small changes had become second nature. Drinking slowly meant she never felt that dizzy rush in her head. Waiting to take her full drink until after her medication gave her mornings a steady hum rather than unpredictable swings in her energy. Staying upright for a while after drinking meant breakfast was comfortable and her chest stayed light. And keeping the water lukewarm, never icy, left her feeling settled instead of tense. They were small acts, but together they created a kind of safety net she didn't even know she'd been missing. One morning, as she sat at the kitchen table watching the gulls sweep low over the shore, she realized she hadn't felt that strange heaviness in weeks. Even the stiffness in her knees seemed to ease faster now. She didn't know if it was the hydration itself or the calm start that made the difference, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that she felt more in control of her body's first hour each day. Her daughter noticed too. "You seem lighter," Lila remarked one Sunday as they prepared lunch together. "Not just in how you move, but in your face. You don't have that tired look you used to have in the mornings." Kinsley smiled, thinking about how such simple adjustments, things most people wouldn't even think about, had brought her here. "It's funny," she said. "I didn't change what I drink, only how I drink it." Sometimes Kinsley would think back to the morning when her doctor had first hinted that her water habit might be doing her more harm than good. At the time, it had felt almost silly. How could something so pure, so essential, be part of the problem? But now she understood that it was never about the water itself. It was about meeting her body where it was today, not where it had been 20 or 30 years ago. The changes had done more than steady her mornings. They had shifted her mindset. She began paying closer attention to other little habits she'd carried forward without question. The foods she reached for at breakfast, the way she stood up too quickly from a chair, the hours she spent without moving when reading in the afternoon. She noticed that each time she made a small, respectful change, Her body rewarded her with a little more steadiness, a little more ease. On a crisp morning in early autumn, she sat with her tea and watched the sun break over the water, streaking the sky in orange and rose. She thought about how she used to start the day on autopilot, rushing to drink, rushing to move, rushing without reason. Now, there was no rush. She had learned that morning set the tone for everything that followed, and when she gave herself a calm, steady start, the rest of the day had a way of unfolding with the same grace. And so, each morning, she lifted her glass not just for hydration, but as a quiet ritual of self-respect. It was her way of saying, I am listening, I am adjusting, I am still learning how to care for myself in this season of life. And in those first, gentle sips, she found something that felt like strength. Not the strength of her younger years, but a new kind, built from awareness and the simple, steady choice to begin each day with intention. It was a Tuesday morning when Kinsley noticed something she hadn't felt in a long time. As she stood by the kitchen counter buttering a slice of warm bread, she realized her hands weren't trembling the way they sometimes used to in the mornings. It wasn't dramatic, but it was there, a steady calm in her fingers, a smoother motion as she spread the butter evenly. She paused for a moment, the knife in midair, and wondered if this too was tied to the changes she'd made in her mornings. The thought followed her throughout the day. She'd started her morning the same way she had for weeks now. Slow sips of room temperature water, medication with just enough liquid to swallow, staying upright and letting her body wake on its own time. But perhaps the biggest difference wasn't just in her hydration, it was in the way she was approaching her body as a whole. She was no longer pushing it forward as if it were a stubborn old cart that needed force to move. She was inviting it, coaxing it into the day gently. That afternoon, she took a walk to the small park down the street. The air was crisp, the kind that made each breath feel cleaner somehow. As she walked, she noticed her steps felt lighter, her posture a little straighter. It wasn't a miracle. Her knees still ached when she climbed the slope toward the benches. But there was a steadiness that kept her moving without hesitation. She sat for a while, watching a group of children chase each other around the swing set, their laughter spilling into the air. For a brief moment, she thought of her younger self, running after Lila in that very park, never once considering the mechanics of her own body. When she got home, she poured herself another half glass of water, not out of thirst, but out of habit. It struck her how this small change in the morning had begun to ripple into the rest of her day. She was drinking more consistently, but never in a way that overwhelmed her system. And without planning it, she'd started to make other adjustments too, stretching her legs before getting out of bed, adding a few slices of fruit to her breakfast, turning off the television earlier at night so she could sleep more deeply. One evening, Lila came by with a bag of groceries. As they unpacked them together, Kinsley mentioned how she'd been feeling steadier lately. It's funny, she said, I thought I was just fixing one small habit, but it feels like that one habit woke up the others. Lila smiled as she placed a carton of eggs in the fridge. Sometimes that's how it works, Mom. You change one thing, and it reminds you you're capable of changing more. The next morning, as the light spilled across her kitchen table, Kinsley took her usual slow sips and thought about how far she'd come from that first uneasy conversation with her doctor. She wasn't just avoiding dizziness now, she was building a kind of trust with her own body again. It felt like they were on the same team, no longer pulling against each other. And for the first time in a long while, she wasn't just thinking about how to get through the day, she was thinking about how to live it well. That realization settled over her like a warm blanket. It wasn't about perfection or about never feeling tired or stiff again. It was about noticing when something felt off, listening to that whisper and making an adjustment, however small, before it became a shout. And it all began with that first gentle sip of water each morning. The first real test of Kinsley's new routine came on an early Friday morning in November. Lila had invited her to spend the weekend in the city for a small family gathering, and the train left just after sunrise. Kinsley loved visiting her daughter's apartment, the bustle of the streets, the smell of bakeries on the corners, but she also knew that travel had a way of knocking her off balance. Schedules shifted, mornings felt rushed, and the small rituals she'd built could slip through her fingers if she wasn't careful. That morning, she woke while the world was still dark. The suitcase sat neatly by the door, and her coat hung on the back of the chair. She went to the kitchen and found herself staring at the empty spot on the counter where her usual glass of water should have been. In the rush of packing the night before, she'd forgotten to set it out. A small pang of disappointment ran through her. This was how it started, wasn't it? One skipped step, and before you knew it, the habit unraveled. But then she remembered something her doctor had told her. Routines don't live in the glass or the counter, they live in you. So she filled a small thermos with room temperature water, slipping it into her tote bag before she even put the kettle on for tea. She sipped a little while the toast browned, taking her time even though the clock was already nudging her toward the door. The familiar rhythm, sip, pause, breathe, wrapped around her like a thread tying her to home no matter where she was going. At the station, the air was sharp with cold, and the platform bustled with early commuters. She found a seat on the train by the window, set her bag beside her, and took out the thermos. A man across the aisle glanced up from his newspaper and smiled. "Starting the day right," he said, nodding toward the drink. She smiled back, thinking how once upon a time she might have drained it in a few quick gulps without a thought. Now she unscrewed the lid and took a small sip, letting it settle before taking another. The motion of the train beneath her seemed to match the slow, steady way she'd learned to greet her mornings. When she arrived at Lila's apartment, the warmth and noise of the city spilled through the open windows. There was coffee brewing, music playing softly in the background, and the chatter of neighbors in the hallway. It would have been easy to slip into the rush of it, to skip her careful pace and let the day sweep her along. But when Lila offered her coffee right away, Kinsley smiled and said, "Let me finish my water first." It wasn't about being rigid, it was about giving her body the small gift it had come to rely on. Later that afternoon, as they walked through the crowded streets to pick up bread for dinner, Lila asked, "How's the new habit holding up?" Kinsley told her about the thermos, about taking slow sips on the train, and how it had kept her grounded despite the change of scenery. Lila squeezed her arm and said, "That's the thing about good habits. The ones that matter find a way to travel with you." That night, as she lay in the guest room with the city lights flickering through the blinds, Kinsley realized she'd passed an important milestone. It wasn't just that she'd kept the habit going away from home, it was that she no longer saw it as fragile. This routine wasn't something she had to cling to, it was something she carried quietly and easily, like a favorite scarf in her bag. The next morning, she filled her glass at Lila's kitchen sink and stood by the window, sipping slowly as the city woke up below. Cars hummed, voices drifted up from the street, and a bakery's warm scent curled into the air. Everything around her was different, but inside, the start of the day felt just as it did at home, calm, steady, and hers. It happened on a rainy Thursday, the kind of day when the clouds seemed to press low over the rooftops and the sound of water drumming against the windows made it hard to leave the warmth of bed. Kinsley woke later than usual, her body heavy from a restless night. The glass she'd left on her nightstand was still full, but she didn't reach for it right away. Instead, she shuffled into the kitchen, craving the comfort of a hot cup of coffee to chase away the damp chill in her bones. As the kettle hissed and the rich smell of coffee filled the air, she told herself she'd drink the water afterward. It was just one day. What harm could it do? She poured the coffee, wrapped her hands around the mug, and took that first deep, satisfying sip. The warmth spread through her chest, but after a few minutes, she noticed her head felt oddly fuzzy. Her legs were slow to respond as she moved toward the table, and there was a faint, dry tightness in her mouth that no amount of coffee seemed to fix. She set the mug down, realizing with a small pang that this was exactly how she used to feel before the changes. The fog in her head, the slight imbalance in her step, it wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to remind her how different her mornings had been just weeks ago. She glanced at the untouched glass of water still sitting on the nightstand and felt a quiet tug of regret. By mid-morning, the sluggishness hadn't lifted. Even folding laundry felt heavier than it should. Finally, she poured the water into a fresh glass and took a slow sip, letting it settle. It didn't erase the morning's discomfort entirely, but she could feel her body easing back toward balance. It struck her then that the shift she'd made in her routine wasn't just about the water, it was about claiming the first few minutes of the day as a space for care, not for shortcuts. That afternoon, Lila called to check in. They talked about the weather, about a new recipe Lila was trying, and then Kinsley admitted she'd skipped her morning water. "I thought it wouldn't matter," she said, "but I could feel the difference before I'd even finished my coffee." Lila's voice softened. "It's not about perfection, Mom. It's about noticing. You noticed, and you came back to it. That's what keeps a habit alive." Her daughter's words settled in Kinsley's mind. She realized that old habits never really disappear. They linger quietly, waiting for a moment of tiredness or distraction to slip back in. But that didn't have to be a failure. It could be a reminder, a chance to choose again. The next morning, when she woke to the sound of rain still pattering against the glass, she reached for her water before her feet touched the floor. The slow sips brought with them a steadying calm, as if her body was saying, "Yes, this is how we begin." The coffee came later, warmer and more satisfying because it followed the gentle rhythm she'd worked to build. By the end of the day, she'd almost forgotten the stumble from the day before. What stayed with her wasn't the discomfort of skipping, but the knowledge that she could slip and still return. That her new way of caring for herself wasn't fragile after all. It was flexible, forgiving, and stronger than she'd given it credit for. It was a crisp Saturday morning when Kinsley decided to stop by the small cafe on Main Street. She hadn't been there in months, not since she'd started spending more of her mornings at home, but she'd made plans to meet her old friend Margaret. The two had known each other for over 40 years, their friendship stitched together through book club meetings, shared recipes, and long conversations over tea. Margaret was already there when Kinsley arrived, sitting near the window with her coat draped over the chair. She looked tired, her smile warm, but a little faded around the edges. As they ordered, tea for Kinsley, coffee for Margaret, the conversation quickly turned from pleasantries to health. Margaret admitted she'd been feeling unusually dizzy in the mornings, her energy low and her appetite unpredictable. "I thought it was just my age catching up," she said with a shrug, "but some days it makes it hard to even get moving." Kinsley listened closely, the description tugging at something familiar. She thought back to her own mornings not so long ago. The lightheadedness, the heaviness in her legs, the strange sense of starting the day half a step behind. It was as if she were hearing her old self in Margaret's voice. "Can I tell you something?" Kinsley asked, leaning forward slightly. She began to share the story, how her doctor had pointed out the way she drank water in the morning, how she'd learned to slow her sips, to give her medication space to work, to stay upright, to choose warmth over ice, and to never skip hydration altogether. She told Margaret about the difference it had made, not just in her body, but in her whole sense of starting the day with steadiness instead of struggle. Margaret listened with growing interest, her coffee cooling in front of her. "I never thought about it that way," she admitted. "I've been gulping down a glass of cold water before my pills for years, and on some mornings I skip it entirely and go straight for the coffee." Kinsley smiled gently. "That used to be me. I thought I was doing everything right, but these little changes, they aren't about being perfect. They're about making it easier for your body to work with you instead of against you." They sat there for over an hour, the cafe slowly filling with the hum of conversation. Margaret asked questions: how much water, when to drink it, what temperature worked best. Kinsley answered, not like a teacher, but like a friend sharing something she'd learned the hard way. It wasn't a lecture, it was a quiet offering, a way of saying, "I've been where you are, and there's a softer way forward." When they finally stood to leave, Margaret wrapped her scarf tightly around her neck and said, "I'm going to try it tomorrow. Not all at once, but I'll start with the water before anything else. Slowly, like you said." Walking home, Kinsley felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the autumn sun. She realized that the changes she'd made weren't just helping her, they had the power to ripple outward, to touch someone else's mornings too. That thought made the habit feel even more rooted, as if it had grown beyond a personal routine and become a small act of care she could pass along. The next week, a message came from Margaret. It was short, but full of quiet triumph. "Tried it for 4 days now. No dizziness this morning. Thank you, my friend." Kinsley smiled, setting the phone down beside her tea. Sometimes, she thought, the best thing you can do with a good habit is to share it, not to prove you're right, but to remind someone that change is possible, even in the smallest of ways. Kinsley's mornings are no longer the rushed, dizzy starts they once were. What began as a single change, slowing her first sip of water, grew into a gentle rhythm that steadied her energy, eased her digestion, and softened the edges of her day. She learned to give her medication the right space to work, to stay upright and let gravity help her, to choose warmth over icy shock, and to never let a morning pass without a quiet moment of hydration. These weren't dramatic overhauls. They were small, deliberate shifts, each one layered on the next until her mornings felt like they truly belonged to her again. And somewhere along the way, these changes stopped being just about water. They became a way of listening to her body's whispers, to the subtle cues that say, "not yet," or "this feels better." Kinsley's story is a reminder that the habits we've carried for decades aren't beyond adjustment. Even in our 70s, even in the quiet routines we think we know by heart, there's room to grow gentler with ourselves, It doesn't have to be overwhelming. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be intentional. So tomorrow morning, before the coffee, before the rush of the day, give yourself that same kindness. Pour half a glass of water, sip it slowly, and let your body know you're paying attention. Small changes may not seem like much at first, but they have a way of reshaping the hours that follow, and in time, the years ahead. Because caring for yourself in this season of life isn't about clinging to what once was. It's about honoring where you are now and giving yourself the steady, loving start you deserve every single morning.